The modern seeker confronts a paradox that has haunted humanity since the first alchemist gazed into the crucible. Why does transformation elude those who pursue it most fervently? The answer lies not in the absence of desire, nor in the lack of technique, but in the fundamental misunderstanding of what constitutes the vessel itself. The alchemical vessel, the vas hermeticum, was never merely a physical container. It represents the psychic architecture necessary to contain, sustain, and direct the volatile energies of transformation. Without this container, the work collapses into fantasy, inflation, or psychological catastrophe. This principle echoes through centuries of esoteric tradition. Hermes Trismegistus, in the Corpus Hermeticum, spoke of the mind as the sacred space where divine transformation occurs. The Emerald Tablet, that cryptic document which Dennis William Hawke decoded as a blueprint for consciousness itself, declares that, as above, so below, a statement not of cosmic poetry, but of psychological necessity. The macrocosm requires a microcosmic vessel capable of mirroring and sustaining its operations. Without such correspondence, the work remains theoretical, impotent. Paracelsus understood this when he wrote that the alchemist must first become the experiment. The laboratory is secondary to the soul. Jung, drawing from these same wellsprings, recognized that individuation, the process of becoming whole, requires what he termed a temenos, a sacred precinct within the psyche, where contradictions can coexist without mutual annihilation. This is the vessel. Manly Palmer Hall, in his encyclopedic surveys of secret teachings, repeatedly emphasized that the mysteries were never about external manipulation, but about the construction of an internal cathedral capable of housing the divine fire. The Hermetic school stands on this principle. Transformation is an internal enterprise, a psychological and spiritual operation that demands more than intention. It demands structure, discipline, and the deliberate construction of a psychic container strong enough to withstand the dissolution of the ego, the confrontation with shadow, and the integration of what Otto called the mysterium tremendum. The vessel is not given. It must be forged through rigorous self-examination, ethical commitment, and sustained practice. This is why casual spirituality fails. This is why New Age optimism collapses into disillusionment. The container was never built. To understand the vessel, one must first comprehend the system it serves. Alchemy, properly understood, operates through the three philosophical principles: salt, sulfur, and mercury. These are not chemical substances, but psychological realities. Salt represents the body, the fixed principle, the material substrate of consciousness, what Jung would identify as the ego structure and its attachment to concrete reality. Sulfur is soul, the volatile principle of desire, passion, and individual will, the animating fire that drives transformation but threatens to consume without proper containment. Mercury is spirit, the mediating principle, the fluid intelligence that moves between opposites, dissolving and recombining, what Eliphas Levi called the astral light, the medium of magical operation. The vessel must contain all three in proper proportion. An excess of salt produces rigidity, fundamentalism, the inability to change. Excessive sulfur creates manic inflation, grandiosity, the spiritual bypassing that masquerades as enlightenment. Unbound mercury generates chaos, dissociation, the endless seeking that finds nothing because it refuses to crystallize into form. The alchemical vessel functions as the fourth principle, the container that allows these three to interact productively rather than destructively. This quaternary structure appears throughout esoteric tradition. The Kabbalists spoke of the four worlds: Atziluth, emanation; Braya, creation; Yetzirah, formation; and Asaya, action. Each world represents a level of manifestation, but without the vessel of consciousness to traverse these levels coherently, the aspirant becomes lost in either abstraction or materialism. The Kybalion, that controversial but influential text, articulates 7 hermetic principles, but the first, the principle of mentalism, establishes that the all is mind. The vessel is consciousness itself, properly structured and directed. Neoplatonism provided the philosophical foundation for this understanding. Plotinus described emanation from the One through nous, divine mind, to soul to matter, as a process requiring careful navigation. The soul's descent into matter is necessary for experience, but without the vessel of philosophical practice, contemplation, virtue, dialectic, the soul becomes trapped in materiality, forgetting its origin. The vessel is the practice itself, the disciplined return upward through the hypostases. The Rosicrucian tradition explicitly taught the necessity of preparation. The Fama Fraternitatis describes Christian Rosenkreutz's long apprenticeship before he could open the tomb of illumination. The vessel here is the cultivated character of the adept, humility, discernment, and moral rectitude. Without these qualities, esoteric knowledge produces not illumination, but obsession and madness. The mentality required of the true adept differs fundamentally from the casual curiosity of the dilettante. It demands what Aleister Crowley termed true will, not the petty desires of the ego, but the alignment of individual purpose with cosmic order. It requires what the Hermetic school recognizes as the occult ethic, the understanding that knowledge confers responsibility, that power without wisdom is destruction, and that the work is never undertaken for personal aggrandizement, but for the sake of truth itself. Most critically, the adept must maintain what the phenomenologists called epoché, the willingness to suspend certainty, to doubt even cherished conclusions, to remain in what Keats identified as negative capability. The vessel must be flexible enough to accommodate new understanding, while remaining strong enough not to collapse into relativism. This is the razor's edge the genuine practitioner walks, between dogma and nihilism, between inflation and deflation, between the Scylla of certainty and the Charybdis of doubt. The vessel, then, is not passive. It is the active cultivation of a psychic architecture capable of sustaining transformation. It is built through study, through meditation, through ethical practice, through the deliberate construction of what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold opposites in consciousness without premature resolution. Without this vessel, the alchemical work cannot proceed. The fire either goes out or burns the house down. The alchemical transformation proceeds through distinct stages, each requiring specific operations within the psychic vessel. The classical tradition identifies multiple operations, but the complete work unfolds through 4 primary phases that structure the entire opus: Nigredo, blackening, Albedo, whitening, Citrinitus, yellowing, and Rubedo, reddening. These are not sequential events, but recursive cycles, spiraling deeper with each iteration. Nigredo, the descent into darkness. The work begins with Nigredo, the blackening, the mortificatio. This is the deliberate confrontation with everything the ego has repressed, denied, and projected outward. Jung recognized this as the encounter with the shadow, the totality of unconscious contents that the conscious personality refuses to acknowledge. The vessel here must withstand profound disillusionment. The practitioner confronts the gap between self-image and reality, between intention and action, between professed values and actual behavior. This stage manifests psychologically as depression, though it differs from clinical depression in its teleological orientation. The alchemical depression has purpose, the dissolution of false structures. The ego, which has organized consciousness around adaptation to social demands and the avoidance of anxiety, must be partially dissolved. This is experienced as death, the death of the persona, the death of cherished identifications, the death of the fantasy self. The symbolic language of alchemy describes this as the putrefactio, the rotting of the prima materia. The initial substance, the naive, unexamined psyche, must decompose. Dreams during this phase often feature corpses, graves, descents into underworld spaces. The practitioner may experience overwhelming shame, guilt, or disgust with their own existence. This is not pathology. This is the necessary preparation of the soil. The vessel's function during Nigredo is to prevent 2 catastrophic outcomes. First, it prevents suicide, literal or psychological. The darkness must be endured, not escaped. Second, it prevents premature escape into compensatory inflation. The temptation to declare oneself already enlightened, to bypass the darkness through spiritual materialism or metaphysical fantasy, is overwhelming. The vessel, constructed through prior discipline and ethical commitment, holds the practitioner in the darkness long enough for the work to complete. Operationally, this stage requires rigorous self-examination. The practitioner must inventory their resentments, their envies, their petty cruelties. They must acknowledge the ways they have harmed others and themselves. They must recognize their participation in the very evils they condemn in the world. This is not self-flagellation but honest accounting. The alchemists called this separatio, the separation of the pure from the impure, the valuable from the worthless. The psychological mechanism at work involves what Jung termed active suffering, not masochistic dwelling in pain, but conscious engagement with psychic material that the ego has spent years avoiding. The practitioner sits with their shame, their fear, their rage, without acting them out or repressing them further. This holding creates pressure within the vessel, heat that begins the transformation. Without the container, this pressure disperses or explodes. With the vessel properly sealed, it transforms. Albedo. The washing and purification. From the blackened, putrefied matter emerges the second stage, albedo, the whitening. This is the stage of purification, of washing, of the baptism of the materials. Psychologically, this represents the emergence of insight, the beginning of conscious relationship with previously unconscious contents. The shadow, having been acknowledged, can now be partially integrated. Jung described this as the encounter with the anima, or animus, the contrasexual elements within the psyche. For the man, the anima represents the repressed feminine qualities, receptivity, emotion, intuition, relatedness. For the woman, the animus represents the repressed masculine qualities, assertion, logos, discrimination, structure. These figures appear in dreams and fantasies as guides, lovers, or antagonists. The vessel must now expand to contain the tension between conscious identity and these powerful archetypal forces. The danger of albedo is premature crystallization into false wholeness. The practitioner, having survived Nigredo, may mistake the relief of albedo for completion. The white phase can produce a kind of spiritual narcissism, a detached, ethereal state that avoids the full messiness of incarnation. This is why many spiritual practitioners become trapped in perpetual meditation, in aesthetic withdrawal, in philosophical abstraction. They have achieved albedo but mistake it for the completion of the work. The vessel's function here is discrimination. The practitioner must learn to distinguish between genuine insight and ego-soothing fantasy, between authentic encounter with the self and identification with archetypal images. This requires what the Buddhists call right view, the ability to see clearly without attachment or aversion. It requires what the Stoics called prososh, continuous attention to one's mental processes. Operationally, albedo involves active imagination, dialogue with unconscious figures, and the gradual construction of what Jung termed the ego-self-axis. The ego must learn to relate to the self, that totality of the psyche which transcends conscious control, without either inflation, identifying with the self, or deflation, feeling crushed by the self's demands. This is the true beginning of individuation, not the dissolution of the ego, but its proper relationship to the greater psyche. Dreams during albedo often feature water imagery, washing, baptism, crossing rivers, diving into clear pools. These are not mere symbols but indications of psychic movement. The vessel must be permeable enough to allow this flow while maintaining enough structure to prevent dissolution into the unconscious. The practitioner learns to move between conscious and unconscious realms without losing their center, without becoming possessed by the figures they encounter. The white phase produces a peculiar clarity, a moon-like illumination that reveals contours without the harsh glare of solar consciousness. This is the realm of reflection, contemplation, and subtle perception. The practitioner begins to see patterns in their behavior, to recognize recurring themes in their relationships, to understand the symbolic structure of their personal mythology. But this understanding remains cool, detached, not yet integrated into the full heat of lived experience. Citrinitas, the dawn of solar consciousness. Between the cool reflection of Albedo and the red heat of Rubedo lies a crucial transitional phase that many modern interpreters neglect. Citrinitas, the yellowing, the xanthosis of the Greeks. This stage represents the first stirring of solar consciousness, the dawn that precedes full daylight. The medieval alchemists considered this phase essential, though later traditions often collapsed it into Rubedo. Yet its psychological reality remains distinct and necessary. Citrinitus marks the moment when insight begins to generate its own light. In Albido, the practitioner sees by reflected light. Understanding comes from external sources, from teachers, from texts, from the archetypal figures encountered in the unconscious. In Citrinitas, understanding becomes self-generating. The practitioner begins to think alchemically, to perceive symbolically, to grasp intuitively the deeper patterns that structure both psyche and cosmos. Jung associated this phase with the emergence of the intuitive function and the development of what he termed symbolic consciousness, the ability to perceive the symbol as a living reality that participates in both realms simultaneously. The symbol is no longer a sign pointing to something else, but a presence in itself. This shift in consciousness is subtle but profound. It represents the movement from learning about transformation to becoming transformative. Psychologically, Citrinitas manifests as a quickening, a sense of intellectual excitement and creative possibility. Ideas that were previously theoretical suddenly reveal practical applications. Concepts that seemed abstract become experientially real. The practitioner discovers they can work directly with psychic energy, can consciously participate in processes that were previously automatic and unconscious. This is the birth of what the tradition calls operative consciousness. The vessel during Citrinitas must accommodate increased volatility. The yellow phase is characterized by what the alchemists called multiplication, a rapid expansion of consciousness, a proliferation of insights, a sense that everything is suddenly meaningful and interconnected. This can be exhilarating, but also destabilizing. The danger is dispersion, becoming so enchanted by the flow of symbols and synchronicities that one loses practical grounding. Dreams during this phase often feature sunrise imagery, golden light, birds in flight, and ascension. These symbols indicate the psyche's movement toward greater consciousness, but they also warn against inflation. The practitioner must remember they are observing sunrise, not becoming the sun. The vessel provides this reality check, maintaining the distinction between ego and self, even as the ego becomes more permeable to self-energies. Operationally, Citrinitas requires disciplined creative work. The insights flooding consciousness must be given form, through writing, through art, through service, through teaching. This is not premature evangelism, but necessary externalization. The internal pressure must find appropriate channels, or it creates inflation. The individuating person discovers they have something to offer, not from ego achievement, but from genuine contact with archetypal depths. The yellow phase also marks a critical ethical transition. In Nigredo, ethics meant not acting on destructive impulses. In Albido, ethics meant honoring the symbolic realm and not literalizing metaphors. In Citrinitas, ethics becomes creative responsibility, the obligation to use emerging gifts wisely to serve something beyond personal gratification, to become a conscious link between unconscious depths and collective consciousness. The alchemical texts speak of the peacock's tail appearing during this phase, a momentary display of all colors, a psychedelic flourishing of possibility. This is both blessing and test. The vessel must contain this riot of color without shattering, must allow the practitioner to experience the full spectrum of consciousness without fragmenting into multiple personalities or collapsing into grandiosity. Rubedo, the reddening and integration. The final primary stage is Rubedo, the reddening, the rubificatio. This is the stage of the philosophical gold, the integration of all that has been separated and purified into a new whole. Psychologically, this represents the achievement of individuation, the creation of what Jung called the self, not as an archetype among many, but as the realized totality of the personality, consciously integrated and actively lived. Rubedo is characterized by the conjunctio, the sacred marriage of opposites. Conscious and unconscious, masculine and feminine, light and dark, spirit and matter, all the polarities that have structured the psyche now find reconciliation. This is not a bland averaging, but a creative tension that generates new life. The red phase is active, engaged, incarnate. The gold produced is not inert, but living, capable of ongoing transformation. The vessel at this stage must be strongest of all. The temptation is to rest, to declare the work complete, to settle into the achievement. But Rubedo is not an end state. It is a capacity. It is the ability to continue the work, to apply the alchemical principles to new material, to serve as a vessel for others who undertake the journey. The true adept becomes a vessel for the work itself. Jung described this as the realization of the self in the world. The individuated person does not withdraw into solipsistic bliss, but engages more fully, more consciously with reality. They have achieved what the alchemists called the lapis philosophorum, the philosopher's stone, not a substance, but a state of being characterized by psychological gold, incorruptibility, clarity, value, and generative power. Operationally, Rubedo manifests as embodied wisdom. The practitioner has moved through reflection, Albido, and creative insight, Citrinitus, to fully incarnated understanding. Knowledge is not merely held, but lived, not merely spoken, but demonstrated through being. The red phase requires courage, the willingness to stand in one's truth even when it conflicts with collective norms, to act from inner authority even when it invites criticism or misunderstanding. The psychological gold of Rubedo possesses what the alchemists called tincturing power, the ability to transform base material into gold. This is not literal magic, but psychological reality. The individuated person, by their presence and their way of being, catalyzes transformation in others. They do not proselytize or manipulate, but simply embody a more conscious way of existing. This presence acts as a mirror, a catalyst, a silent teaching. Dreams during Rubedo feature royal imagery. Kings and queens, sacred marriages, golden cities, the birth of the divine child. These symbols indicate the achievement of psychological sovereignty, not control over the unconscious, but conscious participation in its purposes. The divine child represents the ongoing creativity that emerges from the union of opposites, the perpetual renewal that characterizes individuated consciousness. Each stage requires the vessel to function differently, yet the vessel remains constant. It is the disciplined, ethical, examined consciousness of the practitioner. Without this container, Nigredo becomes depression without purpose, Albedo becomes dissociation, Citrinitas becomes manic inflation, and Rubedo becomes destructive identification with archetypal power. The vessel is what transforms suffering into wisdom, experience into insight, and knowledge into being. Within the fourfold structure lies a singular crisis that determines the success or failure of the entire operation, the moment of absolute despair. The alchemists called this the Nigredo profundus, the deepest black, the point at which all light appears to be extinguished. Jung recognized this as the encounter with what he termed the death archetype, not literal death, but the psychological death that precedes rebirth. This is the dark night of the soul that John of the Cross described, though the esoteric tradition recognizes it as a universal principle transcending any single religious framework. This crisis cannot be avoided, softened, or bypassed. It is the necessary consequence of sincere work. As the practitioner progresses through Nigredo, cataloging their failures and confronting their shadow, a moment arrives when the entire edifice of meaning collapses. Everything they believed about themselves, about reality, about the possibility of transformation, all of it appears as delusion. The work itself seems futile. The vessel that has contained them through the process suddenly feels like a prison. They see no way forward and no acceptable way back. Phenomenologically, this state manifests as a peculiar form of suffering that differs from ordinary depression. Clinical depression often involves a flattening of affect, a numbing emptiness. The alchemical crisis, by contrast, is characterized by acute sensitivity, a hyperconsciousness that experiences the absurdity and tragedy of existence without the protective buffers of rationalization, distraction, or hope. The practitioner sees clearly, perhaps for the first time, the inevitability of death, the impermanence of all attainments, the ultimate aloneness of consciousness. This is not nihilism born of cynicism, but nihilism born of unflinching perception. The danger is real. Without a properly constructed vessel, this crisis produces breakdown rather than breakthrough. The practitioner may literally abandon the work, may seek refuge in former identifications, may collapse into addiction or compulsive behavior. More subtly, they may undergo what Jung called regressive restoration of the persona, a return to social adaptation that abandons the quest for authentic selfhood. The vessel must hold. What distinguishes the alchemical crisis from pathology is its teleological dimension. Pathological despair is circular, self-referential, without purpose. It feeds on itself. The alchemical despair, by contrast, is purposive. It serves the dissolution of structures that must be dissolved. It is the fire that burns away the dross, the acid that separates gold from ore. This distinction is subtle but crucial. Both feel unbearable. Both involve genuine suffering. But one leads nowhere, while the other, properly contained and endured, leads to transformation. The medieval alchemists understood this when they insisted that the work must be conducted in a sealed vessel, the vas hermeticum. The sealing was not to prevent contamination from without, but to prevent escape from within. The volatile materials, heated to their boiling point, will attempt to escape. The vessel must remain closed. Psychologically, this means the practitioner must resist every escape route: distraction, rationalization, premature transcendence, false integration. The ethical dimension of this crisis deserves emphasis. The despair often centers on moral revelation, the recognition of one's own capacity for evil, selfishness, and harm. This is not theoretical. It is visceral, shameful, devastating. The practitioner sees how they have manipulated others while claiming to love them, how they have pursued power while professing humility, how their spirituality has served their narcissism. This recognition is so painful that the temptation to retreat into self-justification is overwhelming. But retreat at this point aborts the process. The vessel's function is to hold this awareness without either fleeing into self-hatred or escaping into self-forgiveness. Both are premature resolutions. The material must remain in solution, in suspension, held by consciousness but not yet integrated. This is the meaning of the alchemical phrase solve et coagula, dissolve and coagulate. The dissolution must be complete before new coagulation can occur. Existentially, this crisis confronts the practitioner with the fundamental question: is transformation worth this cost? The answer cannot be intellectual. It must emerge from a deeper stratum of being, from what Heidegger called resoluteness, from what the mystics called faith, from what the alchemists called the secret fire. This is not blind optimism, but a kind of ontological commitment that precedes and transcends rational calculation. The vessel at this point becomes almost imperceptible. It is not experienced as support, but as constraint, not as protection, but as limitation. Yet it continues to function. It is the discipline that keeps the practitioner returning to meditation when meditation seems pointless. It is the ethical commitment that prevents revenge when resentment overwhelms. It is the structure of practice that holds when belief collapses. The crisis resolves not through insight but through endurance. The practitioner does not suddenly understand why they suffer. They simply continue to suffer while refusing to abandon the work. And in that continuation, something shifts. The darkness does not become light, but it becomes bearable. It becomes eventually revelatory. What seemed like meaningless destruction reveals itself as necessary preparation. The vessel, which seemed to be merely containing suffering, was actually transforming it. This transformation operates through a principle the alchemists called mortification leading to vivification, death that gives birth to life. The ego that dies in the crisis was never truly alive. It was a construct, a defensive formation. What emerges after the crisis is not a new ego, but authentic selfhood, consciousness rooted in something deeper than personal history, identity, or achievement. The vessel has transformed the practitioner's relationship to their own existence. What emerges from the crucible is not the ego that entered, but something fundamentally transformed, yet paradoxically more authentic. The alchemical gold, the aurum philosophicum, is not a new personality constructed from whole cloth, but the essential nature of the individual, purified of accretions, integrated with what was previously unconscious, stabilized in its relationship to the self. Jung termed this achievement individuation, but the term can mislead. It is not a state of blissful completion, nor does it confer supernatural powers. Rather, it is characterized by several interrelated qualities. First, psychological flexibility, the ability to respond to circumstances without compulsive reactivity, to hold multiple perspectives without fragmenting, to tolerate ambiguity without premature closure. The individuated person has developed what Buddhist psychology calls equanimity, though achieved through Western depth methods. Second, ethical clarity. The transformation confers not rules but discrimination, the ability to discern what serves life and what serves death, what expands consciousness and what contracts it. This clarity emerges not from moral philosophy, but from direct experience of the consequences of actions on the psyche itself. The individuated person acts ethically not from duty, but from understanding. They have passed through the yellow phase of Citrinitas, where creative insight dawned, into the red heat of Rubedo, where insight becomes incarnate action. Third, creative engagement. The psychological gold possesses what the alchemists called tincturing power, the ability to transform base material into gold. Psychologically, this means the individuated person can bring consciousness to previously unconscious material, can facilitate transformation in others, can create works that embody archetypal energies. They have become, in Corbin's phrase, imaginal practitioners, capable of operating at the level where psyche and matter intersect. The practical applications for the modern individual are profound, yet subtle. The individuated person does not withdraw from the world, but engages more authentically. They recognize societal conditioning without being enslaved by it. They participate in collective life while maintaining access to individual truth. They hold professional roles, maintain relationships, pursue goals, but without the desperate attachment that characterizes ego-driven activity. Crucially, this state carries immense responsibility. The alchemical tradition is explicit. Knowledge confers obligation. The individuated person cannot retreat into private salvation. They become, whether they choose it or not, a vessel for others. Their presence, their way of being, either facilitates or hinders the transformation of those around them. This is not spiritual inflation, but ontological fact. Consciousness affects consciousness. The Hermetic school insists on this principle. Transformation is never merely personal. The work undertaken for oneself reverberates through the collective psyche. Each person who achieves genuine integration slightly alters the collective consciousness, makes it marginally more possible for others to do the same. This is the esoteric understanding of the Bodhisattva vow, reframed in Western terms. The commitment to work, not for personal salvation, but for the elevation of consciousness itself. The vessel, having served its function, does not disappear. It becomes internalized, automatic, structural. The individuated person no longer requires external discipline because the discipline has become second nature. They no longer need to consciously hold opposites because their psyche has organized itself around the transcendent function. The vessel has become them. They are simultaneously container and contained, the alchemist and the gold, the work and the worker. Yet vigilance remains necessary. Regression is always possible. The alchemists warned that the gold, once achieved, must be protected. Psychologically, this means ongoing practice, continued self-examination, maintenance of the ethical commitments that structured the vessel. Complacency is the final danger, the assumption that transformation, once achieved, is permanent. The work continues, but it changes in quality from desperate striving to joyful participation. The individuated person relates to life with what the Greeks called metis, practical wisdom, cunning intelligence, the ability to navigate complexity without rigid formulas. They have learned through the fourfold process, through the black death of Nigredo, the white reflection of Albido, the yellow dawning of Citrinitas, and the red embodiment of Rubedo, that reality is not fixed but fluid, not determined but creative, not mechanical but alive. They participate in this aliveness consciously, responsibly, generatively. The Hermetic school's emphasis on discipline, rigor, and authentic engagement with the tradition becomes clear from this vantage point. The transformation cannot be achieved through casual interest or weekend workshops. It requires years of sustained effort, guided study, ethical practice, and willingness to endure the crisis that precedes genuine change. The vessel must be carefully constructed, consciously maintained and trusted even when all seems lost. Only such a vessel can contain the full spectrum of the alchemical work, from the black depths to the white purification, to the yellow dawn, to the red completion. The gold you seek exists not in the crucible but in the will that kindles the fire, and in the vessel strong enough to contain black death, white reflection, yellow dawn, and red embodiment, without shattering under the sacred weight of your own becoming.